Yeah, so I work at the Evidence Policy and Influence Collaborative at the Charles Perkins Center. That's my team. Nobody ever wants to introduce me using that, so I don't blame you. And I'm also the senior editor for Cochrane of the Public Health and Health Systems Network. And that's important to know because Cochrane is the journal I'm going to talk about today. And Cochrane, the database of systematic reviews, our journal publishes only systematic reviews. We don't, an evidence synthesis, so not primary research. But I see Cochrane through a rather different view than a lot of people because I work with the public health groups, and so those are the groups that generally don't deal with randomized controlled trials. We do qualitative evidence synthesis, we do mixed methods stuff. So it's not often what people think of if they're familiar with Cochrane right off the top of their head. But what I really want to talk about today is, as of last week, I got a new job in Cochrane, a new part-time job, and I am the senior editor of Research Integrity. And Cochrane is also hiring a full-time research integrity editor. And so I was going to give this talk, generally I'll, giving advice for people based on my research, advice for journals and what they do. But given what happened last week, I scrapped all that, and I'm going to talk about Cochrane instead. But this is not an official Cochrane talk. I'm new in this post, so this is really a chance for me to brainstorm. And I'd love to be able to get your feedback on what we're doing. And so my disclosure is relevant because I actually get paid for this Cochrane work, which is 20% of my time. It goes to my university, and that's going to morph into this research integrity editor. I also have consulting fees from the World Health Organization to work on their norms and standards, which are often based on systematic reviews, and research grants from the NHMRC in Australia. So this position is called Senior Editor Research Integrity, and the first thing we need to do is put parameters around that position. And I know that there's been a lot of talk at this meeting, and it seems to be a lot of talk for decades on what actually is research integrity. So I think this is important that you understand what I'm talking about. Oops, sorry. So this is one of the original definitions: fraud, fabrication, and plagiarism. And then it morphed into a definition of fraud and misconduct. And we know that is really the tip of the iceberg in terms of research integrity. And then misconduct, people started to throw a lot of things into that bucket. Ian Chalmers, I think, was the first to call publication bias and selective outcome reporting a form of research misconduct. Recently, the ICMJE called failure to disclose conflicts of interest a form of research misconduct. So a lot is going into this misconduct bucket now. And then we have definitions of research integrity like this, and what you'll see are a lot of words here. This is from a National Academy of Science report. And what I see are concepts around transparency, research methods, and then behaviors. And so I think those are the things that we want to tackle in Cochrane and work on how we can improve these transparency methods and behaviors. And then we have accepted principles of research integrity, which we've heard a lot about at this meeting. And then we have these, quote, newer terms, and I think one of the biggest sources of research waste actually is recreating the wheel. And so we talk about reproducibility and transparency and open data, et cetera. The one part of research waste that's incredibly important that I'm not going to talk about is priority setting. And Cochrane does have initiatives related to priority setting, and those aren't going to fall under the research integrity bucket here. But I do want to acknowledge that that's very important, and it's going on. So this is a pretty complicated picture, and using that very, very broad definition of research integrity, we've got problems. So this is my research group's mascot. His name is Bailey. He's a metapug. There's all sorts of internet sensation metapugs on the internet. We like Bailey. And basically this is a pug dog wearing a pug costume, and that is a metapug. Now, the reason we know that we have so many problems in research integrity is because a lot of people do meta research. A lot of people do research on research. And unfortunately, meta-researchers do not have this warm and fuzzy feeling like the meta-pug. They tend to evoke ire and hatred sometimes, because what we do is point out problems. And Cochrane is even worse, because Cochrane does systematic reviews of meta-research, which is getting very, very meta, I know. So basically we do reviews of meta-research studies, and this is just an example of some of our reviews that have highlighted problems. And I know in this audience we all know what the problems are, so I'm not going to dwell on that, but we've done reviews that showed that there are unpublished studies, that there's selective outcome analysis and reporting, that there's an impact of funding source and conflicts of interest on outcomes of drug trials and of systematic reviews. So those are just some of the Cochrane reviews. There's a lot of other meta-research out there pointing out problems that fell under that big bucket of research integrity. So what in the world is a journal to do? I mean, journals are way at the end of the research process. So how can they have much of an impact? And in a way, for Cochrane, it's even worse, because we're doing systematic reviews of primary research. So what in the world can a journal do? And luckily, journals can do quite a lot. Journals can demand that people use reporting guidelines. We've heard a lot about that at this meeting. They can demand study registration, that protocols are published, so these are ways to increase transparency. They can demand funding and conflict of interest declarations, data sharing. They can have really strict contributorship or authorship criteria, and they can do forms of peer review that are more transparent, like open peer review. And a lot of journals now are doing these things, and people are measuring their impact on primary research. And I'll just use an example here of reporting guidelines, because all of these things are only good if they're enforced, right? So that's, that's where the issues come in. And we know, for example, with reporting guidelines, here's the ARRIVE guidelines. My team does some work on animal studies, although Cochrane doesn't publish animal studies now, but we know there's bias in animal studies. And after the introduction of the ARRIVE reporting guidelines, you can see the black bars are the better things. Oops, sorry. And if something was really good, it's not going to get better. And in other areas, maybe we didn't see as much progress as we liked, but there was an impact of the reporting guidelines. And for the PRISMA guidelines, which are the ones for systematic reviews, it's the same thing. We have seen improvements, and it's the blue bars there in a lot of areas and this is all the aspects of reporting a systematic review, from the search to the data extraction, data analysis, and how it's reported, and even the conclusions. And we've seen some improvements in that as well. And so that's just how journals can have an impact on the research that's going into them. But since we're on the subject of PRISMA, and since I'm talking about the Cochrane Library today as our journal, meta-researchers have had a real fondness for attacking systematic reviews lately. There's heaps and heaps of criticism of systematic review as a method. I've actually published some of that. And so I think this criticism is actually good. It's good to have this kind of scrutiny, but it's some of the solutions that have been bothering me about what we should do about problems with systematic reviews. And the reason I get concerned about this is because I think of what are systematic reviews used for, and I love it. We started with this very modern talk, on all these great resources, and now I'm showing you Greek columns. But anyway, this is how I think about research. It's all about how you frame the question, how it's designed, conducted, and reported. That's to me is the basis of research. And if any of those pillars fall down, we don't have trustworthy evidence, we don't have systematic reviews, and we can't use them then for clinical practice guidelines or health policy. So the whole house falls down. And what would be the alternative then if we don't have systematic reviews? Because that's been one of the suggestions. And, you know, we might go back to this for decision making, which frankly, if we do, I'll just retire now, you know. There's no need to go on. So I don't think getting rid of systematic reviews is a solution, because I don't want to go back to this. And I think Hilda Bastian actually put it quite well in a blog she wrote recently, where she said, we need a lot of solutions. And discrediting conventional systematic reviews or proposing radical changes in methodology without strong evidence aren't solutions. And I think this is going to be a big agenda for Cochrane in the research integrity area. We want to get the evidence to know what are the changes in systematic review processes you know, that we need to really improve the integrity of the process. So our answer is, let's make systematic reviews better through the lens of research integrity. And by that, I mean, let's try to improve, or this is what falls under our research integrity area, and we're not going to tackle all of these at once. And in fact, that's what I'd like to hear from you all when we have time, is about, you know, what might be some priorities. And so far, Cochrane has actually done a lot to contribute to solutions. And some of you actually may be familiar with Cochrane or have, you know, seen the Cochrane database of systematic reviews. But even so, you might not know exactly all the things that Cochrane has been doing. So Cochrane has been using reporting guidelines. They're called the Messier standards. What's nice when you do a Cochrane review, they actually run alongside the software. So you've got the reporting guideline as you write your review as a little help to get it written in a structured format, and they're quite detailed. Cochrane has provided guidance on searching trial registries, and for areas, not all of them in public health, obviously, but areas where studies would exist in trial registries, authors are encouraged to search those trial registries. We publish protocols since 1993, and I actually think we should call them registered reports, because what they are is they are basically the Cochrane review written all the way up to the results section. So they've got the introduction, they've got the rationale, they've got the research questions, they've got the methods, they've got the analyses, and they're written in the Cochrane structure, and they adhere to those reporting standards all through that structure up into the results. And so, you know, we've been doing that since 1993. We have funding and conflict of interest declarations, and I'm going to go into this as one of our examples, because this is something that changed in Cochrane based on evidence. We have a conflict of interest policy since 2006, and it's actually just been strengthened, which I'll also touch on. We have a lot of data, metadata, that goes into Cochrane reviews, and we share that data with people. So the way to get that data is you can request it from Cochrane and have a Cochrane person, a reviewer, potentially involved in your protocol. It's sort of like the Yoda database or some of those other databases where you write a protocol, you request the data, and then you can get it. And we have really interesting authorship criteria, because Cochrane reviews are updated. When you sign on to a Cochrane review, it's kind of a lifelong commitment, and we find out, you know, people actually don't want that, so sometimes they want to get off the, you know, the authorship list as the review is updated, new people come on. So they're kind of interesting, not your standard authorship criteria. And then we've had, in 1991 is actually when I joined Cochrane, for the sole reason of working with Drummond Rennie, who was creating a post-publication peer review system for Cochrane. So we had that in 1991. People could look at any Cochrane review, they could send in peer review comments post-publication, and because the reviews are updated, then the review could be revised according to those peer review comments. Now, the really sad thing is nobody used it, you know, and I like to say it's because we were before our time, but basically nobody used it. And we see now with a lot of post-publication peer review, or even pre-publication, you do have to invite a few people to comment if you want to make sure you get some comments. So anyway, and Cochrane, of course, has traditional peer review. All of our protocols are peer reviewed before publication, and they're, modified. And then all of the final reviews and updates are also peer reviewed before publication, and we use a named peer review system. So I think actually, given how long Cochrane's been around, there's been a lot of innovation going on related to strengthening research integrity. And this is just an example of how Cochrane, this is actually shows that it pays off, because this is on reporting guidelines, and Cochrane does consistently better on reporting guidelines for systematic reviews than other journals. But this is an example of how Cochrane will change what it does based on, excuse me, data. Oops. And we want to do a lot more of this. So this is a Cochrane review that Andreas Lund has updated 3 times. I'm an author of this. And this is a review, it's one of these meta research reviews. And it looked at studies that were drug studies that were sponsored by drug companies, and compared them to other sponsors, and saw whether the drug company sponsored studies were more likely to have a favorable effect than studies with other sponsors. And they are more likely to have a favorable effect. And by favorable, it means it shows the drug is more effective compared to comparator, or less harmful compared to comparator. So they're about 30% more likely to have this favorable result. Now this is an observation, and there's been about 30 years of research going on to explain this observation, and there's many ways that this can be explained. Everything from how the questions are framed, how the studies are designed, how they're conducted behind the scenes, and then whether they actually are published in full or not. So there's a lot of reasons for this, this observation. But it did make us wonder about 2 things. Since we have this finding, shouldn't Cochrane reviews then show what funding sources are in the studies that are included in those reviews? So it's about transparency. When you're reading a Cochrane review, and I know this because a patient came up to me and said, God, Lisa, you do all this work on conflicts of interest, and I just read a Cochrane review, and it's got 7 trials in it, and I had to go and dig to find out they were all drug industry funded. Why doesn't it say that in the abstract? Why isn't that really obvious to me? And so we wanted to find out with Cochrane reviews how obvious this was, and we also compared to reviews done by other journals. And Michelle Roseman, who was working with Brett Toombs, was the lead student on this project. She was a master's student. And what we basically found in looking at the Cochrane reviews, I'm not going to focus on the other ones now, is that only 30% of the Cochrane reviews actually disclosed the funding source of the studies included in the review. This is 10 years ago, approximately. They're from 2010. And only 11% disclosed the conflicts of interest of the investigators of the studies included in the review. So this was really, really poor, and it was actually worse in other journals. And this paper, Michelle won the Bill Silverman Prize, which I love because it's a prize that Cochrane gives to someone who publishes a paper criticizing Cochrane. I think it's just a great thing. So Michelle won the paper that year, and I was very proud to have even been a part of it. So that was exciting. That answered our transparency question, not so good. And then the other big question that comes up is, okay, we have this observation. How should we incorporate this into assessing the studies included in Cochrane reviews? And we've had a big debate in Cochrane about whether funding source should be included in what we call our risk of bias tool, which assesses basically empirical bias in studies. And I always take the blue pill, and I argued, yes, it should be in the risk of bias tool. And Jonathan Stern has argued no. And I had to swallow that bitter blue pill because it's not in our risk of bias tool, but I'll explain what we did. And so what happened after all this went on and Cochrane was exposed to all this data and debate? Well, Cochrane introduced Messier standards that required that every included study have its funding source disclosed and conflicts of interest of the authors disclosed. So basically, we introduced a reporting standard, to take care of that disclosure bit. And then we're working on 2 new risk of bias tools. One of them, Matt Page is leading up, and it's called ROB-ME. I love it. It's a great acronym. And the ROB-ME tool is the risk of bias related to missing evidence. And basically, remember I said missing evidence is one way that we get that observation about the drug industry sponsored studies. So if they don't include all the evidence, that can be one of the possible explanations. So Matt's working on that. And then Andreas Lund is working on a tacit tool, which is a tool for assessing conflict of interest in trials. And basically, this will be a separate tool that will incorporate a way to change the effect estimates based on funding source and conflicts of interest of the authors. So this is what Cochrane did in response to these studies. And we do have Kim Turner, who's another master's student now 10 years later, working with Brett, just completely repeated the study we did before looking at disclosures. And we have published the protocol for this, but we haven't published the results yet. It's coming out soon, I hope. But I'm okay to talk about this. And I just want to show you that basically the disclosure of funding source, since the standard was introduced, went way up. And so did the disclosure of author conflicts of interest. This is in the studies included in the systematic review. So we thought that was a positive effect. That's good. All right, so these are some of the things I think in the future we're going to focus on. And again, this is not, Cochrane speaking, this is me speaking, but these are areas where I think we've, got a lot of work to do, and we've got data that we can potentially work with. And what I want to emphasize here is we now have, 1.2 FTE to do some of these things, but we need to work with other people. We want to work with other groups, and we're not a funding source, unfortunately. So we have to figure out a way to get it funded. What did I do? I am pushing the big button. Help is on the way. Oh, no, I don't want the pointer. I want to advance it. Can you advance it? So I'll talk a little bit about, sorry. Right, so basically this small editorial team is going to focus on research because we want to change the way we do reviews based on evidence and then policy, and then we want that evidence to inform any changes in our policies, and then we want to do advocacy around research integrity. So some of the research ideas for primary studies is Cochrane has great data on bodies of evidence on different topics. And in that data, we can detect issues of validity, reliability, analysis, robustness in publications and data that we include in Cochrane reviews. And right now, Cochrane reviewers do this all the time. It's not done in a systematic way. We're not looking for certain things all the time. It differs by the different review groups and research topics. And so we want to map across Cochrane what we're actually doing and how we can actually systematize that better. And ideally, I think we would want to automate this. Once we identify patterns, wouldn't it be great if we could do some natural language processing to help us identify those patterns across the board? Because right now it's, it's occurring on an ad hoc basis. And then we also want to, and then we think that will improve then primary studies because we would, identify ways to fix those problems. Now, for systematic reviews, one of the big things we want to focus on is bias selection of data for meta-analysis. And I have a grant now looking at bias in nutrition research, and Matt Page is leading a part of that where we're looking at how data were selected for inclusion into meta-analyses on nutrition. And this is an area that we actually don't see described a lot in protocols, and so this is why I think it's really important. So what I mean by that is it's a huge decision for the systematic reviewer to say, you know, I've got, you know, these 4 outcomes, or 4 ways the outcome is measured, or 4 time points that are measured, and this outcome is eligible for my review. So which time point do I pick? Which way of measuring it do I pick? And what we see is that's not often pre-specified, or sometimes it is. One of the studies Matt found is really interesting because it said, we selected the outcomes for our review based on their statistical significance. If they were statistically significant, we put them in our review, which, you know, I was just appalled, but I have to say at least that was honest, you know. We know how they did it. But we find that, you know, we're missing this a lot, and I think we're missing this in Cochrane as well. So we want to be able to improve this. I've said we've been, you know, publishing these registered reports or protocols since 1993, but what we haven't really done is evaluate them. So I think we need to look at what's missing in our protocols, what's unclear, what we need to improve, and also we need to see how people are accessing those protocols, because when peer reviewers look at our review, they can look at the protocol, it's publicly available, and we don't know how much people are using those protocols. We also know we publish protocol amendments, and I'm not sure we have a consistent way of identifying what those amendments are. So I think, you know, we've got this great data on using these protocols, but this is a way to assess how they've been used and what their impact is. And then another topic will be, you know, because what matters when you're doing a systematic review basically is what affects the outcome. That's what we want to know. What's going to affect our effect estimate? And so we have some researchers in Cochrane who are keen on restricting Cochrane reviews only to prospectively registered trials. Well, that's certainly not a change we want to make across the board unless we know what effect that has on the outcomes of systematic reviews. And so we'll be doing pilots in those groups so they can actually see what the difference would be if they exclude trials that aren't registered prospectively. I actually think it's going to be a lot more important potentially to look at whether we should be relying on studies that had published protocols or studies that had analyses plans. And so we can also do that very easily with Cochrane. We can do sensitivity analyses to see what difference it would make if we only focused on studies that had published analyses plans, for example. So I think, you know, we might want to refine what we include in Cochrane reviews, but we want to do that based on evidence. And there's a real efficiency reason to do that, but that's not the only reason. We want to do it if we know there's evidence, it'll change the outcomes of our reviews. And then we have a lot of research behaviors in Cochrane we can tackle, but I think these are some of the ones that'll be top of the list. We've had so many interesting authorship issues lately. I raised one this morning about somebody who wanted to be anonymous, and we have consumer reviewers now, and they have concerns about confidentiality. We've done surveys on ghost and guest authorship before in Cochrane, and frankly, it's been not good, and we need to update that and see how that's going. And as I said, we actually change authorship a lot over the course of a review, and you know, maybe we can just automate this whole thing. Wouldn't it be great? You know, you write down your roles. I love what you were rolling your movie credits, you know, because right now it's tough with authorship. So you might have contributed to a review for 5 years, but if you retire and don't want to contribute anymore, then you're moved to the acknowledgements. And that's really sad, you know, because it's like over for you, that review. So I think we need to totally change the way we're doing that. As I said, we have a new conflict of interest policy, and we want to measure the impact on, again, the outcomes of reviews on having that stricter policy. And then we also, Quinn Grundy, who's just moved from Sydney to Toronto, is leading up a project on a method for addressing bias related to non-financial interest. She's a social scientist, and they've got all sorts of methods for doing that we're not using in science. So those are some of our top priorities. And the reason we're going to do all this research is we want it to feed into making our policies evidence-based and changing our policies. One of our top ones in terms of implementation is our new conflict of interest policy. We want to have training that's based on this evidence so people know, if Cochrane is changing what they're doing, why are we doing it? And I think this is so important, and this is where Cochrane desperately needs help, is we need a systems approach to do this. And we've been writing, Cochrane has a huge software team now. It started out to be a teeny tiny software team, and we've been writing like our own software for years and years and years and years. And now there's like so much great stuff out there. Is there a way we can take advantage of that as well? Okay, advocacy. Advocacy is actually what I love to do, and this meeting's been great because basically what we want to do is collaborate with people who can actually influence the conduct of primary research as well as evidence synthesis, and we'd like to collaborate with people in terms of research. And this is just an example of what I call advocacy. I'm talking about conflicts of interest because that happens to be my research area, but Ray Moynihan at Bonn University and I were guest editors for this series in the BMJ on basically how research in health care and clinical practice and policy and education, could become independent from commercial influence. And we've commissioned a lot of articles for this, and the series will be ongoing for a few months. And what I loved about this, and it was Ray's idea, was we had a call to action. Please sign our call to action. And I know many of you have, which is great, so thank you. But if you haven't, you might want to consider it. And we've got about 300 names on there so far. And people have sent in ideas about what we could do to advance this agenda. And Ray led a paper putting out some very high-level ideas, and now we're commissioning 3 papers from that, one to talk about ideas in terms of independence in research, one for education, and one for practice. And of those people who have sent in ideas, that's all going to be published, and we also are incorporating them into those authorship teams. And so, we want to come up with some concrete ideas, which of course would need to be tested. And Cochrane's Carla Suarez-Weiser is the editor-in-chief of the Cochrane Library, and in this issue she announced our newer conflict of interest policy as part of this agenda to gain independence. And another area, and this relates to the public health, but the American Journal of Public Health has agreed to have Cochrane submit a series on some of the methodological issues related to public health reviews that we've been dealing with, and that Cochrane's developed tools for, actually, but we don't do a very good job of getting them out there to the public health community. Cochrane people know about them, but people in public health might know about them. So this is in a collaboration where we want to get those tools shared better. They're all open access, and get them out. So these are just some ideas, and it's way too much to do with 1.2 FTE, to try to increase research integrity through Cochrane and to decrease those poor research practices. But I'll open it up now if we have time for any comment. Thank you.
Where is there? Is the first question.
Yeah, thank you for a fascinating talk. I'm Anne Scheel, I'm from Eindhoven University of Technology. You mentioned pre-registration and that the protocols that are registered for Cochrane reviews are already at a stage where you would call them registered reports. The way I understood is that they are not registered reports in the sense that they are not reviewed and accepted for publication before they are carried out. And is that something that, so the way I understand registered reports is this procedure basically. You send out a pre-registration, it undergoes review, it is accepted for publication, then you collect the data. And so this is something that Paul Whaley, who's editing at Environment International, is doing there now for systematic reviews as well. So is this something that you have considered? Because I feel like it is such a nice way of aligning the incentives in a way to ensure research integrity, and it seems that the stakes are very high at Cochrane.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I probably wasn't clear, and I don't want to get bogged down in the terminology, but what we call a protocol is, you know, everything up to the results. So I think that's like a registered report, and it is submitted, and it is peer-reviewed, and then it's published, and then people do the review. So to me, that does seem a lot like a registered report. I mean, maybe it's not, but I see the similarity. So I didn't mention at first that they were peer-reviewed, but they are. And they're also subject to our post-publication peer review that nobody uses, but never mind. So, yeah. So to me, they are very similar.
Other questions? There's one right in the back.
Hi, Robbie Thibault from University of Bristol. You mentioned whether you think it would be different if you look at only prospectively registered studies rather than all studies. I'm wondering if any systematic reviews have done that already, and if any of those that do it have looked at prospective registration that haven't switched their outcomes.
Yeah, to my knowledge, that hasn't been done. I could be missing something, so I think that's why we want to do it. We have 2 review groups in Cochrane that are dying to do that, because they're under the impression that the outcomes of their reviews will be different and sounder if they only include the prospectively registered one. And to your point, I actually think looking at other aspects of the study, not just whether it's registered or not, is potentially more important in terms of influencing the outcome. But that's my hypothesis, so I think that also needs to be tested.
I'll give the honor of the last question to Malcolm.
So thanks, Lisa. I see that your Cochrane data sets are available on reasonable request, which is not FAIR compliant. Do you think that's a sustainable position for the Cochrane?
Yeah, I think, I don't know, actually. I think we would like, there's a lot of requests to get the data, and the biggest issue with getting it is that it's taking a long time. And I think with our current technology, that's actually a real problem, and I hope we can change that in the future.
Okay. Then it's my honor to thank you.
Thank you.
And of course, for you as well, we have this mystery bag.
It's not from a drug company.
So I actually don't know what's in here.
I better check. Yeah.
Please check. Make sure that's under $35. I don't know what the limit is.
Thank you so much.
Thank you one more time for me.